Hello, and welcome to the collapsing lecture. Today we're actually going to focus on the second half of the round, but before we even get to how to collapse, we should probably learn what collapsing is. And collapsing is just argument selection in a way that is strategic for you. In other words, it's narrowing the round down to one or two strategic arguments that help you win the round. This process normally starts in summary, but there are definitely some hints that you need to pick up on, starting from the constructive, that will allow you to collapse effectively. So, why does collapsing actually matter? Think about it, up until the first summary, there are probably six contentions or three contentions more commonly that you're going to have to probably funnel into a 3-minute speech. So, in your mind, the decision calculus is, okay, should I focus on the quality of responses, right? So maybe picking one or two, or should I just go for everything and then my judge will pick up on whatever's important? It's most likely strategic for you to pick the former and go for the quality of arguments, but how do you actually go about doing that? That's what this lecture is for. So what's the process like? So the process starts before the round even starts. The first thing is that you have to acknowledge is getting into the right mindset. You have to acknowledge that you don't need to win everything that's presented in the round. Dropping arguments can actually be really strategic for you and can be more effective than going for everything. So how do I actually pick what arguments I need to go for? That's where step 2 and 3 come in. Starting with step 2, remember Han and I have emphasized that you need to have a narrative. In other words, a center focus for the pro side and for the con side. So think about how that narrative interacts with the most common arguments on the topic. So for example, on this topic in particular, if I'm on the pro and I'm reading accessibility, my immediate go-to is, okay, I need to learn how my narrative about accessibility interacts with that of innovation. The reason why I do that is because then I pull out arguments from my contention or my entire case that specifically hint at my narrative about accessibility. So that way I don't deviate away and there's this cohesiveness and at the end of the round. The third step is this idea of weighing. So know how your arguments actually stack up against the stock arguments of your opponents. So it's helpful for you to do this because it allows you to then think, okay, what argument has the biggest impact, or what argument is my judge going to care about the most, especially in context of this round. But you can really start to think about that before the round even starts. So running with our previous example about innovation and accessibility, if I'm on the pro once again and I'm advocating for accessibility, before I even walk into the round, I'm thinking, okay, if my opponent reads innovation in this round, then I know that I can stand up and say that it doesn't matter how many drug companies actually end up innovating and releasing a drug into the market if consumers can't access that drug or afford it, which is why affordability is always going to come first and our case comes first. Notice how if I do that, then I don't actually have to go down the line by line and respond to every single component of why innovation matters. Instead, I can just spend more time on accessibility and say that my argument is a prerequisite to theirs. So again, it's better time allocation and it allows you to kind of prioritize. But now let's get into during the round. So during the round, there are 3 things that you can focus in on. The first of which are faces. Your judges have an opinion. So oftentimes, especially if they're first year outs or second year outs, and honestly, even me, right, who's a senior in college, is going to actually have an opinion and is going to probably display that, right, in the round whenever you say something that they either agree with or disagree with for that matter. They may not be super obvious by aggressively nodding their head, but that doesn't mean that they're not giving you subtle cues. So things that you should look for are basically facial expressions, specifically how their eyebrows look, right? So if I am kind of skeptical about an argument, you'll probably see me just squint my eyes or my eyebrows will kind of like narrow in, right? Focusing on and picking up on those small little cues will help you emphasize and be like, okay, this is how much time I need to spend on this argument. This is how much time I need to spend on this other argument. You can look for these facial cues while you're reading your case, while your opponent is reading their case, and then finally during both rebuttals. So that way you know what arguments your judge is buying and accordingly what arguments are going to become really important for your judge towards the end of the round. The second thing that you need to focus in on during the round is time allocation. often the argument your opponent is going to go for is the one that they actually spend the most amount of time on. So for example, if I have 3 contentions, and let's say I spend a minute on the first 2 contentions, and then 2 minutes on the third contention, because the third contention is the one that's the longest and thus the most fleshed out, chances are that it's the strongest argument that my opponent is going to end up going for. Another way you can look at this is based off of rebuttals. So people have incorporate overviews into their rebuttals that kind of get an idea as to, or kind of focus in on one contention in particular, or just like focusing in on their narrative. Pick up on those cues so that you're able to find some sort of direction with the collapse that's going to happen later in the round. The last portion is this idea of coverage. Pick the path of least resistance. That includes things like turns, your contentions, your opponent's contentions, or really just any other responses like non-uniques that have not been addressed. As long as you pick something and you tell me why it matters in the round and you blow it up, it'll be very convincing for your judge. Don't worry, it doesn't, just because you lost one contention doesn't mean that you lost the entire round. That entire process comes down to weighing. So what do you do if your opponent actually ends up covering every single argument and every single response super well? That's really rare, first of all. But second of all, there are 3 things you can do. The first is conceding a D-link or non-unique to kick out of turns. So for example, if my opponent drops 5 responses to my case, and one of them is a D-link and the other 5 or other 4 impact turns, I can just say, okay, I'll concede the D-link, but they don't get access to all of these turns. The second thing that you can do is actually group responses. Grouping responses is really useful, kind of similar to the way that I talked about with narratives, right? If your narrative encompasses their argument, you can group those responses together. Or let's say in those 5 responses, if there is some commonality between all of those responses at their root, you can actually prioritize it and say, group all 5 of these responses because they have X in common. Now, here's why that's not responsive. Then the last one is even if statements, which come in the form of, even if you buy all of their responses, here's why we still end up getting access to our argument, right? And that basically relies on this idea that the 5 responses don't actually address the internal link or the key warrant of the argument, which allows you to then bypass those responses. Make sure that you're not extending through ink and you're actually explaining and interacting with arguments that are responsive for sure. And if they're not, then tell your judge why they're not responsive. But that's basically it for collapsing. Thanks for joining in.